Stone Cold Prose, building better words.
Say a man dies twice. Once when he takes his last breath, and once when someone says his name for the last time. I think we'd all agree that the words child star carry with them a taint and stain, an element of tragedy, which does not apply to the adult version of stardom. Notwithstanding the qualification of child, which implies a reduced value of the stardom in question, the history of Hollywood is also a history of child exploitation and the brief and often destructive quality of fame as a whole. But Hollywood is a curious word in itself, is it not? It simultaneously describes a town, an area of a great city, a mentality, and an entire industry. And it follows that this industry is alive and well in many places outside of the physical location of Hollywood, and indeed of the United States. Put another way, Americans have neither cornered the market on making movies nor on the dubious morals and practices of the movie industry. Every nation has its own characteristics and quirks, its own peculiarities which govern the way its popular culture is conceived and manufactured. But when one takes a good step back and looks at the movie industry, not only in other lands but in other times, one discovers there is much more that is familiar than that which is strange. A tragic end to those who have been called child stars is sadly not only a common story anywhere cameras roll, but any when. And this takes us to the brief and somewhat incandescent life of Klaus-Detlef Sierck, a boy who came to stardom in Nazi Germany. Hi guys, welcome back to Stone Cold Prose, where we build better words, better thoughts, and better men. I'm Miles Watson, novelist and author of such award-winning series as Cage Life, Sinner's Cross, The Chronicles of Magnus, and now Something Evil, all available on Amazon and elsewhere. I worked in Hollywood for 12 years. I worked in the criminal justice field for about 12 more, and now I break it all down and build it back better. So let's get into this. Me and the cat. Klaus-Detlef Sierck was born in Berlin-Charlottenburg in the Weimar Republic on March 30th, 2025. He was the son of the theatrical and movie director Hans-Detlef Sierck and the actress Lydia Brinken. Klaus-Detlef was what we would call in America a Nepo baby, or second generation Hollywood, right? He was born into the business and therefore perhaps anyway fated to become a part of it. In 1928, when Klaus-Detlef was just 3 years old, his parents divorced and his father soon married the Jewish actress Hilde Yari. Now, whether this encouraged Lydia to join the Nazi Party, I don't know, but she did in fact join, and after Hitler's ascension to power in 1932, she was able to legally bar Hans-Detlef from seeing his only son by virtue of the fact that he had disgraced himself by marrying a Jewess. Now, despite this social stigma, Papa Sierck enjoyed a prosperous career in Germany for a few years, first as a theatrical director and then later as a contracted film director for UFA, a leading German movie studio. At that point, life was not easy for Jews in Germany or for Gentile Germans who were married to Jews, but what we now describe as the Holocaust was still quite a few years away. Eventually, however, he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he and Hilde emigrated to the United States, where he took up the name Douglas Sirk and became a leading director in Hollywood for many years. Indeed, his first feature was the violently anti-Nazi movie called Hitler's Madman, which debuted in 1943. Meanwhile, in Germany, and no doubt encouraged by his mother and perhaps his genes, Klaus-Detlef entered the world of acting. In 1935, when he was just 10 years old, he made the short film The Seeds Are Growing. This was the first of the 13 movies in which he would appear eventually, gradually in ever larger roles. They included Serenade in 1937, A Prussian Love Story in 1938, The Immortal Heart in 1939. It was after this that Klaus really came unto his own with a breakout performance in the mega hit Cadets. This film, which is directed by the ardent and very technically adept Nazi, Karl Ritter, is a superb example of how political messages are best served to the masses as entertainment rather than overt propaganda. Set during the 7 Years' War, it's the story of a group of German military school cadets, mostly very young children, who take up arms against a Russian invasion and make a heroic defense of an abandoned fortress. German boys went crazy over the film. It drove huge box office numbers and most definitely romanticized the idea of war as a rite of passage for the youth, and dying for the fatherland is the ultimate act of patriotism, concepts very dear to Hitler's heart. Much more overt appeal to Nazi ideology came in 1941 when he starred in Chin Up Johannes, in which Klaus-Detlef played Johannes von Riedel, a sullen German kid who grew up in South Africa with his expatriate father and must now adjust to life in the Third Reich. The film depicts Riedel as a prissy, intolerable brat who is eventually sent to a special Nazi school to learn German values, meaning in this case the values and ethics of the Nazi Party, which prized physical toughness, obedience to authority, and loyalty to the group, the blood community. Johannes at first rejects and is rejected by his schoolmates, but eventually begins to get the message, whereupon his life and his relationship with his father and aunt improve, and he becomes a happy, enthusiastic member of Hitler's youth. This movie is as bad as it sounds. It lacks all the subtlety of cadets and is also boiling over with unintentional, if comical, homoeroticism. Would you like to use my soap? Literally a line. Only its depictions of the life of the school have any interest to the viewer at all. Sierck's performance, however, is effective. He's meant to come off as a snarky little shit, and he does quite credibly. Perhaps unfortunately for him, however, Joseph Goebbels, the German Minister for Propaganda, detested the film, considering it too obvious and saccharine to make effective propaganda, and this may have contributed to Klaus' his eventual fate. Goebbels was notorious for his vindictiveness towards artists and actors of any kind who he felt had crossed, vexed, disappointed, or otherwise angered him. Merely appearing in a movie he hated could spell ruin for an actor's career. Now, despite this, Klaus-Detlef had one more moment of cinematic glory to come. In 1942, he appeared as young Prince Heinrich in the big-budget smash The Great King. This film, which was a biopic of Frederick the Great, was meant as a morale builder for Germans anxious about the overwhelming odds that they were facing during World War II. Both Hitler and the Nazis idolized Frederick, who had managed to save Prussia from a vastly superior alliance of nations, very similar to the one Germans themselves were facing during the Second World War. And that was very deliberate. Reminding the German people of Frederick's success in the face of overwhelming odds was a much-used propaganda device during the Nazi era. In any event, The Great King proved to be Klaus-Detlef's final cinematic appearance. For although we know he was part of a theater troupe in Katowice for some or all of 1942, he was soon to receive his draft notice. Now, whether Goebbels accelerated this process out of spite, as he had with some others, such as heavyweight champion Max Schmeling, is unknown. As a member of the class of 1925, Klaus-Detlef would have been eligible for conscription in May of 1943 anyway, and Germany did not exempt actors from military service, although it did permit them furlough to make pictures when possible. His opinions on the Nazis, on the war, and on the role he was about to play, all of that is unknown. But he did end up in uniform, specifically as a Fusilier in the Panzergrenadier Division Grossdeutschland, which in itself is a fact of some interest. The GD, the Grossdeutschland, as it was known, was widely regarded as the elite unit of the regular German army, with special emphasis on spit and polish, Prussian-style drill, and comradeship ritual. And for a long time it was volunteer only, although as it grew larger in size and the war situation became more dire, it eventually found less noble ways of filling its ranks. Members were entitled to wear a special insignia on their sleeve and were expected to show courage far above that expected of an ordinary German soldier. By all accounts, they did. The Grossdeutschland spent most of its service on the Eastern Front as what was known as a fire brigade, rushing from one crisis point to another, inflicting and suffering enormous casualties and participating in most of the great battles of that part of the war. It was by no means uncommon for its units to return from action having suffered as much as 90% losses, with sergeants in command of rifle companies and lieutenants in command of entire battalions. The odds were overwhelmingly against survival for any length of time in that outfit, and like millions of others, Klaus-Detlef's number came up 00. He was killed in action at a place called Novo-Alexandrovka in the Ukraine, possibly on March 6, 1944, though the German magazine Film Courier, the issue number 45, lists his demise as occurring on May 22nd of that year. His grave is located in the Ivanikva military cemetery. He was either 18 or had just turned 19 at the time of his death. Klaus-Detlef's father went on to become a very prolific and successful, if not critically appreciated, director in America, operating under that name, Douglas Sirk, and directing a very impressive 30 films between 1943 and 1959 when he abruptly retired. His work, known for its melodramatic themes and lush visual style, eventually went through a successful critical reappraisal. Quentin Tarantino, Guillermo del Toro, and Pedro Almodovar have all cited him as an influence. One critic noted that while his films were generally dismissed at the time as melodramas catering to women, they contained deeper subtexts. The themes were not always what they appeared to be. Sirk seems to have spent the rest of his life searching for a way to fill the void that his son's death left within him. He had not seen much of anything of Klaus-Detlef since 1928 and nothing at all since 1937. It's doubtful there was any communication between them by mail, especially once the Second World War began in 1939. But we do know that Klaus-Detlef was not only Sirk's only son, he was his only child. And the pain of losing him thrice over, first through divorce, then through Hitler's anti-Jewish laws, and finally through death itself, must have been excruciating. And in the nature of emotional pain, perhaps it grew more unbearable over time rather than less. The American movie star Rock Hudson, who was born the same year as Klaus-Detlef and who made 9 films with Douglas Sirk, described the director as like a dad to me, and I was like a son to him. It is quite possible this relationship offered Sirk a balm for his pain, never having been allowed to either be a father to Klaus or even to oversee his professional development as an actor. Now, an online article I found talks about Sirk's direction of the controversial movie A Time to Love and a Time to Die, 1958. It was one of his last movies. It goes like this. A Time to Love and a Time to Die, a sympathetic story of a young Nazi soldier on the Eastern Front, was greeted with head-scratching bewilderment when it first appeared. It was only 13 years after the war had ended and the world was still recovering from the revelations of the Nazi atrocities. And here was Sirk making what seemed like an apologia for the Nazis and sympathetically portraying the hardships and devastation of ordinary Germans that they had to bear during a war that they unleashed on the world. But today it can be seen for what it actually was, a devastating picture of the devastation that war visits on everyone, victims and perpetrators alike, and one of his most heartfelt films. It was also an unvarnished attempt to reconcile with his estranged and long-lost son. I noted at the beginning of this elegy that child star has a tragic connotation and that fame itself is inherently tragic in many ways, not least of which in its tendency to go much faster than it arrives and to leave no trace behind. Klaus-Detlef Sierck would seem to embody this sense of tragedy to an almost Shakespearean degree. While fame itself did not necessarily destroy him, we simply don't know if Joseph Goebbels had a hand in his going into the army or not, it did not save him. And like Klaus himself, it was quickly forgotten. Now, I'm unsure what the moral of this story is, only that it makes me want to live a little more fully while I'm alive, and to whisper the name of all the Klaus-Detlef Siercks of the world once in a while, if only to try to keep them living. Folks, if you enjoyed today's video, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, hit the notification bell, and remember to check out my books on Amazon, including my World War II series, Sinner's Cross. I'll see you next time, and until then, stay warm. The world is too damn cold as it is.